Welcome to the 19th episode of the series Decolonizing the Mind. In this series, I explain the theory of decolonizing the mind as I have developed in my book with the same title. And the concept of civilization is key to the theory of decolonizing the mind. Episode 18, I discussed how in the West, Eurocentric notion of civilization has developed. In this episode, I'll talk about the concept of civilization in relation to China. But before I do that, I'll go back to the analysis of the current situation in Palestine. And that is important because Palestine is where world history is being written now, as we speak. The peace agreement ended recently, and within 24 hours, the Zionists has killed 700 people in Gaza. And now we stand at almost 16,000 people dead, 10,000 women and children, 41,000 wounded, severely wounded, and there will be no prisoners deal until this war ends. Hamas is portrayed as a brutal force, a barbaric force, but what they didn't show in the Western press is how they treat the civilian prisoners that they have captured. You won't see that in the Western press, but you'll see that in the Arab press, where two captives of Hamas, an elderly woman, Danielle Aloni, and her daughter, Emilia, thanked Hamas for their kind and humane behavior. And you might think, oh, they just were indoctrinated. Maybe that's the case, but their letter that they wrote before leaving Gaza is telling about some of the things that happens which doesn't reach the press here in the West. Danielle and Emilia wrote to Hamas, to the commanders who have accompanied me in recent weeks. It seems that we will part ways tomorrow, but I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your extraordinary humanity that you have shown towards my daughter Emilia. You treated her like your own. You welcomed her in your room whenever she walked in. She says that you are all her friends and not just acquaintances. You are her true and good loved ones. Thank you, thank you, thank you for the countless hours you spent with her as caregivers. Thank you for being patient with her and showering her with sweets, fruits, and everything available, even if it was not readily accessible. Children should not be in captivity, but thanks to you and other kind-hearted individuals and leaders we have met during our presence here, my daughter considered herself a queen in Gaza and felt like she was the center of the world. We didn't meet a single person, whether a member or leader during our long stay in Gaza, who didn't treat her with kindness, tenderness, and love. I will forever be a captive of gratitude because she will not leave this place with a permanent psychological trauma. I will remember your kind manners, which you have shown in her, despite the difficult situation you are coping with yourself and the heavy losses that befell you here in Gaza. I wish in this world that we could be really good friends one day. I wish you all good health and well-being. Health and love to you and your families. Thank you very much, Danielle and Amelia. I signed this letter, and you might have your own thinking about whether it's done under pressure or not. I don't think that's the case. And I say that because if you study the handbooks of guerrilla war, of liberation war, of Mao Zedong, Che Guevara, this is the kind of treatment guerrillas give to the civilians that they capture. So it doesn't surprise me if it's really a true story in conformation with the truth. Many captives who have been freed said that they met Yahya Sinwar, a Hamas leader in Gaza, who spoke with the hostages and who spoke in Hebrew. He was in Israeli prisons for 17 years uh, and learned Hebrew. And he told them they are safe with Hamas. The war already had started, and yet Sinwar, which is one of the highest leaders of Hamas in Gaza, couldn't be captured. And to understand the kind of war Hamas is waging is, if you should read the speech by Hamas leader Khaled Mashal. He said, if the Algerians, the Afghans, and the Vietnamese had listened to the defeatists who demanded that they surrender, Algeria, Afghanistan, and Vietnam would have never liberated themselves from imperialism and occupation. So Mashal is saying our struggle is not for a two-state solution. It's not just for ending the war and a ceasefire. Our struggle, we don't listen to people who say to us, give up, accept a peace accord, accept the two-state solution. No, we look at history, we look at Algeria, Afghanistan, and Vietnam, and we say that is the struggle we are waging today. It's a struggle of total liberation. And that is what you have to understand if you want to understand how this war will develop. Another interesting development of the past week is how Russia and China react to Hamas. The Russian envoy to the United Nations, Vasily Nebensia, said the difficult situation on the ground in Syria, he's talking about Syria, is aggravated by the sharp escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The country, like a number of its neighbors in the region, is literally balancing on the verge of being drawn into a large-scale confrontation. The danger of a large-scale confrontation is looming day by day. Hamas released Russian captives as an appreciation for the Russian position on Palestine. The relation between Hamas and the US is totally different from what people might think. Hamas is not seen as a terrorist organization. Hamas is invited by Moscow to visit the country and develop relations with Russia. Xi Jinping on the International Day of Solidarity with Palestinian people, remember this is an International Day of Solidarity with Palestinian people being celebrated also in China. He said, China has, as always, firmly supported the just cause of the Palestinian people to restore their legitimate national right, he said. And the only viable way to settle the Palestinian question lies in the establishment of an independent Palestinian state that enjoys full sovereignty on the basis of the 1967 borders and with each ruler as its capital. I'll talk about how the two-state solution, which is mentioned here, is viewed by the West and by China and Russia. They mention it more as a formality than the idea that this is the real solution. And the other thing of last week is the joint naval drills that is being planned now between Russia, China, and Iran to safeguard safe passage in the Persian Gulf. And the fact that these armies are working together tells you a lot of what you can expect in a coming confrontation and a regional war that is developing. In the north of Israel and south of Lebanon, Hezbollah is stepping up the pressure with bombings. Yemen captured Israeli ships. In Iraq, they are shelling US bases. Iran is building a coalition with Muslim countries, including Saudi Arabia and Turkey. There are conversations going on even on a military cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So if the genocide in Gaza continues, my guess is that a regional war will be inevitable. Now, we'll see how it goes next week in Palestine. For now, I'm going back to my theme of the concept of civilization and look at how this notion developed in China. I'll discuss shortly the history of China, Mao Zedong and Marxism, Deng Xiaoping and the emancipation of the mind, Xi Jinping and the narrative of civilization, and a Chinese intellectual, prominent intellectual Shang Weiwei, and the concept of a civilizational state. Now, when I study China, I have one limitation. I speak English, I don't speak Chinese. So I can only get the idea of China um, by studying obviously the original sources, the selected and collected works of Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, books and speeches by Xi Jinping. Recently, a few weeks ago, the Communist Party published a book, The Concise History of the Communist Party of China, which outlines the Chinese view of the history of 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party. I benefited from different YouTube channels on China, and one which I find particularly informative is by Cyrus Johnson on YouTube, who is a Westerner but with a lot of knowledge of China, speaks Chinese, and has interesting issues and topics on China. I will discuss China in future series more in depth, and I'll discuss Marxism in future series also. But for now, I will focus on the discussion on civilization. The Chinese civilization is very old, almost 4,000 years, starting 1600 before Common Era at the Yellow River, where the first dynasty was established, the Shang dynasty. I'll go into the concept of the great divergence between the development in China and Europe, the effect of the Opium Wars, and the fall of the Chinese empire, the Chinese emperors, the May 4th movement, and the Marxist revolution. These are the topics I'll deal with. Now, if you want to study in English, how the level of knowledge was in China, one great book, series of book, 7 volumes, 27 books, is by Joseph Needham, who collected with Chinese colleagues a lot of material on mathematics, physics, biology, and chemistry. Interesting book if you want to understand the high level of development of Chinese civilizations before colonialism. One of the questions, if you study the history of China in comparison with the West, you will find this debate called the Great Divergence. How is it that China, who before, let's say 1,000 years ago, had a higher level of technological development. The number of innovations in science and technology was higher in 900,000 before the rise of colonialism. It was higher than in Europe, and yet Europe developed very fast after 1500 in terms of technology and innovations. And Eurocentric historians don't make the link between this development and the exploitation and the rise of the transatlantic enslavement, colonialism. They don't make that link. For example, Max Weber, a German sociologist, very important German sociologist, founder of sociology, looks at religion to explain how the rise of the West came about. Kenneth Pomeranz who compared Britain with China, said it is convenient coal supplies and access to the abundance of the New World. They don't talk about stealing, slavery, exploitation, um, and therefore they don't really understand how colonialism impacted the world and China itself. Now, if you want to understand how Chinese and Western historians look at the history of China, you have to know the story of Shang-Hi in comparison with Columbus. Shang-Hi was from the Chinese civilization, and he was a true discoverer. If you want to read a bit about him and compare it with Columbus, you'll see that Columbus did his voyages, four voyages, and it was all about occupation and colonization. The first voyage in 1492 was with 3 ships. 80 men landed by accident. They were thinking that they ended in India, but they ended in Abhyayala. They kidnapped 7 Tainos and brought them to Spain to show the king that these people could be enslaved easily. The second voyage was with 17 ships and 1,500 men, mostly military, and led to slavery, genocide, and the robbing of gold and silver. Shang-Hi was a general. He was a Muslim general, and his voyages took place between 1405 and 1433, and that was really about trade. When the Emperor Yongle died in 1424, sorry, this Emperor Yongle had commissioned the journeys led by this general Shang-Hi. Shang-Hi was a Muslim general in China. You might be surprised to see that there's a Muslim general in China, but China has a Muslim population, and he is very famous. He went to a journey from China throughout the rest of Asia, going to Africa with 317 ships, 27,000 men. He visited Vietnam, Indonesia, China, Arabia, East Africa, and brought back foreign dignitaries. He didn't kidnap them, who came to pay homage to the Emperor of China and brought exotic gifts such as a giraffe from the ruler of Malindi in Kenya. And after the 6th voyage, the emperor died, and his successor, Hong Chi, ordered a stop to all further expeditions. Hong Chi died a year later, but 7 years later, after his death, his son, Emperor Guande, ordered one last expedition to take the foreign dignitaries back to their homes and their family. Compare that with Columbus, who kidnapped Tainos to show them to the king in Spain and say, hey, these are people we can enslave. Compare that with the civilization of China, where Shang-Hi brings back the dignitaries that they had invited to come to China, and they organize a specific voyage to bring them back. Very different. If you Google YouTube, you'll find quite a few videos on Shang-Hi. Now it's important to, if you study civilization, to study the comparison of Shang-Hi and Columbus and what it meant for the world. Another important aspect when you study the history of China is the concept of the century of humiliation. In 1839 till 42 and 56 to 60, 2 wars were waged by the British and the Americans and the West to force the Chinese emperor to allow the British to import narcotics into China, and in this way addicting millions of Chinese with a devastating drug. The British got rich not only as enslavers and colonizers, but also as drug dealers. The king of Britain was a drug dealer. Now, If you want to understand what the Opium Wars meant, bring it back to how you would look at it today. Two authors, Haynes and Sanellian, made a study of the Opium Wars, and they made this comparison with today. They said, imagine that the Medellin cocaine cartel of Colombia, Pablo Escobar, would mount a successful military offensive against the United States, then forces the US to legalize cocaine and allow the cartel to import the drug into five major American cities, unsupervised and untaxed by the US. The American government also agrees to let the drug laws govern all Colombian citizens who operate in the cities, plus the US has to pay war reparations of US 100 billion, that is the current value today that China had to pay as reparations to the Britain. That's the Colombian cost of waging the war to import cocaine into America. That scenario is, of course, preposterous and beyond the feverish imagination of the most out there writers of science fiction. However, a similar situation occurred not once but twice in China during the 19th century. In both cases, however, instead of thuggish Colombian drug dealers, it was the most technologically advanced nations on earth, Great Britain, that forced similar conditions in China. You don't hear about it in the Western education. It's not part of common knowledge. And you don't make that comparison with the Medellin cartel, and you don't view the kings and queens of Europe as drug dealers, and yet that has been the case. That is the colonization of the mind. Now, important is this. In 1911, a revolution took place in China called the Shanghai Revolutions, where armed uprisings brought down the emperor. In 1911, Sun Yat-sen became the first president of the republic, and 2 months later, in February, the last emperor of China abdicated. So, the old Chinese emperors were a corrupt civilization. And the question is, how do we move from this old corrupt, society led by the emperor? How do we move forward? And the West offered two narratives, liberalism and Marxism. Liberalism says you need to move from barbarism to modernity, and Marxism says you need to move from feudalism to communism. So the liberal narrative could be found in the May 4th movement. What is that kind of a movement? Germany had lost the Chinese territory of Shandong to Japan in World War I. In 1919, there was a peace conference in Versailles, and the Chinese delegates at the conference were hoping to regain control of Shandong. But the European partners of Japan refused to support the Chinese demands, and Shandong remained under the control of the Japanese. And when that news of the conference decision reached China, students from the capital in Beijing staged mass demonstrations on the morning of May 4th, 1919, against the Treaty of Versailles. And that protest spread across the country and led to the Chinese delegation's refusal to sign the peace treaty in Paris. Now, that movement, that May 4th movement, led to questioning the identity of China. What is Chinese identity? What's the Chinese faith? And it culminated in a new movement called the New Culture Movement that took up the intellectual challenge to search the root causes of Chinese misfortune in the modern era, the era of the century of humiliation. Chinese culture was backward, so China needed an enlightenment like the West. And the New Culture Movement posted the old against the new, religion against science, darkness and backwardness against light and progress. They established journals to plead their cause with titles such as New Youth, The New Tide, New Education, Young China, Young World, Youth and Society, The New Voice of Society, New Society, The New Man, The New Learning, The New Culture, The New Student. Everything new, new. You don't go back to the old civilization. You have to build something new, built on the West. But the West had provided another narrative, which was Marxism. And Marxism-Leninism is the ideology of the Communist Party, which was founded in 1921. And the economic idea was central planning. But mind you, already in a very early year, the Chinese communists had to think about the Chinese reality and how to adapt Marxism to that reality. The revolution in China was not a workers' revolution, but a peasants' revolution. Workers were very small. So that was an important adaptation. But regarding the Chinese civilization itself, Mao Zedong regarded that civilization as a feudal civilization, and Confucius and the old Chinese philosophers as feudal philosophers. I'll give you one quote from his works. He says, a given culture is the ideological reflection of the politics and economics of a given society. There is in China an imperialist culture, which is a reflection of imperialist rule, or partial rule in the political and economic fields. This culture is fostered not only by the cultural organizations run directly by the imperialists in China, but by a number of Chinese who have lost all sense of shame. Into this category falls all cultures embodying a slave ideology. China also has a semi-feudal culture which reflects a semi-feudal politics and economy, and whose exponents include all those who advocate the worship of Confucius, the study of the Confucian canon, the old ethical code, and the old ideas in opposition to the new culture and new ideas. Imperialist culture and semi-feudal culture are devoted brothers and have formed a reactionary cultural alliance against China's new culture. This kind of reactionary culture serves the imperialist and the feudal class and must be swept away. Unless it is swept away, no new culture of any kind can be built. There's no construction without destruction, no flowing without damming, and no motion without rest. The two are locked in a life and death struggle. Now, the communists came to power, you know, and then in the first years of the revolution, there was a distribution of land belonging to the landlords, and was distributed to poor peasants. In 1959, the second five-year plan started, and it was called the Great Leap Forward, and the aim was to catch up with the United Kingdom within 15 years. Private ownership was abolished and all households were forced onto state-operated communes based on central planning. It was a great failure. 16.5 million people died. New reforms were announced that followed free market and household responsibility for agricultural productions. But then from the Maoists, there came opposition against this new policy, and Mao and the Maoists started the great proletarian cultural revolution that lasted 10 years between 1966 and 1976. Millions of party members and government officials were accused of being landlords, counter-revolutionaries, and rioters. They suffered public humiliation, imprisonment, torture, hard labor, seizure of property, execution, or harassment to suicide. More than 100 million people were attacked, of whom 20 million died. These are staggering numbers. The Cultural Revolution was a disaster for China. Deng Xiaoping was also a victim of the Cultural Revolution. In October 1969, he was sent to the Xinjiang County tractor factory in rural Jiangxi province to work as a regular worker. And he was a top leader of the Communist Party. A year earlier, after being tortured, his son Deng Pufang had jumped out of the window of a four-story building and became paralyzed. In 1973, Premier Xuan Lai, who had a lot of respect in the party, brought Deng back to Beijing. Deng managed to build a following in the party and the army. On January 8, 1976, Xuan Lai died. And a few months later, in September, Mao Zedong died. And on October 6, a group from the army arrested all the members of the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four were a group of four leaders, among them the wife of Mao Zedong, that carried the Cultural Revolution. They were sentenced to imprisonment. The wife of Mao committed suicide in 1991. One member died in prison, and the remaining two were released from prison in 1996 and 1998. You see, they were not executed. In the 11th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party that was convened in 1977, the Cultural Revolution was declared officially over after 11 long years. Deng Xiaoping was elected to the Politburo and became the de facto leader of the Communist Party. Deng Xiaoping is one of the greatest thinkers of the last few hundred years. He came with ideas and concepts trying to adapt Marxism to the Chinese reality. And he takes the concept of productive force. Productive force in Marxism is technology, the economic basis, which is the basis of every society, mode of production, as the Marxists call it. And Deng Xiaoping starts with this proposition that the aim of our revolution is to liberate and expand the productive forces. Without expanding the productive forces, technology, economy, making our country prosperous and powerful, and improving the living standards of our people, our revolution is just empty talk. We must emancipate our minds. Mind you, he's now already talking about emancipation of the mind, what we call decolonizing the mind. And we should do so even in answering the question as to what socialism is. If the economy remains stagnant and the people living standard remain at a very low level for a long period of time, we cannot say that we are building socialism. Socialism provides more favorable conditions for expanding the productive forces than capitalism do. Here is an adaptation of Marxism, because Marxism was saying basically that capitalism develops the productive forces, and because of that development, socialism is possible. And now Deng is saying, no, with our socialism, with Chinese characteristics, we can expand the productive forces better than capitalism can. Now, this is obviously a deviation from classical Marxism. So Deng says the aim of our revolution is to liberate and expand the productive forces. Without expanding the productive forces, making our country prosperous and powerful, and improving the living standards of our people, our revolution is just... I already had taken this. He says it is wrong to maintain that the market economy exists only in capitalist society, and that there's only capitalist market economy. Why can't we develop a market economy under socialism? Developing a market economy doesn't mean practicing capitalism. While maintaining a planned economy as the mainstream of economic system, we are also introducing a market economy, but it is a socialist market economy. So this is another adaptation of Marxism. He says markets are not characteristics for capitalism. There were markets before capitalism, and we could have markets within socialism. But that doesn't mean if you have markets that you have a capitalist society. So Deng Xiaoping's thinking was the basis of developing the new China. But in terms of foreign policy, he said we should be less ideological in foreign policy, keep a low profile. And he used the term hide one's talent and bide one's time. When the time is there, we could do more, but for now, coming years focus on developing China. And the success is unimaginable in world history. Within a few decades, 800 million people were lifted out of absolute poverty. And now that China has done that, it needs foreign market and foreign mineral resources to further develop their economy and their technology. China is now at a stage where they go well beyond offering low-skilled labor. They offer high-skilled technology. And they are on the world stage in 2013, 10 years ago, they started the Belt and Road Initiative to build a global infrastructure for economic development where everybody will gain. That's totally different than Western colonialism that colonized the world in order to get resources from the global south to the global north. Now, here we go to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping now stays with the Deng Xiaoping's basic philosophy of socialism with Chinese characteristic, but then he introduced a new element, which is the Chinese civilization. He wrote a book, How to Read Confucius and Other Classical Chinese Thinkers. And what he does is he discusses different policy terrains, national governments, politics, diligence, education, individual conduct, foreign affairs, from the perspectives of these classical philosophers. He takes a concept and interprets and develops the concept in such a way that it can be applied to the problems of today. I'll give you one example of the many. He takes Ling Seqiu. This is a scholar from the 18th century, 18th, 19th century. And he was a scholar politician during the Qing dynasty. And Xi Jinping takes one quote. The reason for the sea being so wide is that it can accept all rivers. And then he commands. He takes this concept and applies it to civilization. He says civilization is inclusive. Because of the inclusiveness, human civilization has the power of exchange and mutual reverence. The reason for the sea being so wide is that it can accept all rivers. All kinds of civilizations created by men are the fruit of labor and wisdom. Each civilization is unique. Blind acceptance and imitation of a civilization is not only impossible but harmful. Any achievement of civilization should be respected and cherished. And he develops this idea. In May 2019, China organized a dialogue of Asian civilization attended by 1,300 representatives of 47 countries. And the aim was to foster exchanges between Asian civilizations, learn from each other, and establish a community with a shared future. Xi Jinping held a speech in which he said, "We need to uphold the beauty of each civilization and the diversity of civilizations in the world. Each civilization is a crystallization of human creation and each is beautiful in its own way. The aspiration for all that is beautiful is a common pursuit of humanity that nothing can hold back. Civilizations don't have a clash with each other. What is needed are eyes to see the beauty in all civilizations. We should keep our own civilizations dynamic and create conditions for other civilizations to flourish. Together, we can make the garden of world civilization colorful and vibrant." But he gives a warning about the colonial civilization. There will be no human civilization without diversity, and such diversity will continue to exist for as long as we can imagine. Difference in itself is no cause for alarm. What does ring the alarm is arrogance, prejudice, and hatred. It is the attempt to impose hierarchy on human civilizations or to force one's own history, culture, and social system upon others. And that is what the colonial world civilization has done. Now, The theoretical development of this concept of civilization was done by a Chinese political scientist, Shang Weiwei, wrote very interesting books. There are many interesting videos from this professor, and he came up with the concept of civilizational state, which has 8 features: a super large population, India, China; a super vast territory, super long traditions, a super rich culture, a unique language, unique politics, a unique society, a unique economy, or simply the 4 supers and 4 uniques. And Shang Weiwei now argues that China is a civilizational state. China's rise is not the rise of an ordinary country, he says, but the rise of a country sui generis, a civilizational state, a new model of development and a new political discourse which questions many of the Western assumptions about democracy, good governance, and human rights. And all this may well usher in a wave of change unprecedented in human history. The West may actually gain from China's rise in power and ideas, just as many developing or transitional economies have done. This sense of being a civilizational state also means confidence in its own values, discourse, model of development, and political system. China has found its way to success, and this Chinese way has combined elements from China's own fine tradition, socialist ideas, and the Western and other civilizations. And he says a civilizational state can exist and evolve independently of the endorsement of or acknowledgement from others. Its political and economic models are different from others in many aspects. That was the case in the past and is still so now and will remain so in the future, just as the expanding influence of the Chinese language doesn't require the endorsement of the English language. Sun Tzu, The Art of War, doesn't need the stamp of approval of Clausewitz, who wrote a book, German, writing a book on the war. Confucius doesn't need the acknowledgement of Plato, and China's current macroeconomic regulation doesn't need the approval of the US Federal Reserve Board. So he's saying, don't judge us with your Western standard. We have our own standard, and we'll be judged by our own standard. He says, when Britain ushered in the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, its population was around 10 million, smaller than that in any China's major cities today. When France was undergoing the process of industrialization in the 19th century, its population was around 20 million. But China today is already a nation of 1.3 billion people. It is carrying out large-scale industrial and social revolutions under very unfavorable conditions. It has to resolve all its problems internally without resorting to war, and it doesn't plunder other countries. So he compares the rise of China and says we do it without colonialism, without plunder. We have our difficulties and we are overcoming them. So I will go into Russia's narrative of civilization, but keep in mind that the Chinese narrative of civilization is important if we talk about how we are moving from an old colonial world civilization to a new world civilization. That is the topic of the videos that I'm doing in this chapter of what is decolonial theory. So if you want to look up, go into the index and look up China, download the PDF of the PowerPoint, and if you want to support the DTM channel, subscribe to it, share it with friends, family, and colleagues, and encourage them to subscribe, get involved in discussion groups, and make a donation if you can, and look at sandahira.com on how to do it. Thank you for your attention.